Hey students, this is Professor Gore, and in this recorded lecture topic, we're going to be talking about the Roaring 1920s. And so, this is usually a fun decade for a lot of students. A lot going on in terms of culture and social and so forth. And plus, a lot of students have enjoyed The Great Gatsby over the years. You've had to read the book or have seen a couple different versions of the film. So, in this first part, we're going to be talking about some early elections in the 1920s, also women's role in politics, and then kind of what's going on with the economy uh, and also foreign policy. Once we get through those things, in part two, I'll come back to talk about some of the cultural stuff, which usually people find especially interesting. So, um, what you have is after World War One, the Progressive Era has ended, is what historians call it. Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke in 1919 after the Treaty of Versailles and was kind of incapacitated the rest of his presidency. He did not run for a third term. He did not have the health for it. In 1920 was also when the 19th Amendment, was ratified to allow women the right to vote. And despite the first election women get the right to vote, it's actually the lowest voter turnout up to this point in American history in terms of overall percentage of the population that's eligible to vote that actually voted. And so what's kind of interesting is almost like people became disillusioned with politics a little bit in the early 1920s. But we're also going to talk about the government helping and economic growth and so forth and being laissez-faire. So, but in the 1920s, Americans had the highest standard of living anywhere in the world. That really is incredible. A lot of countries really licking their wounds after World War One. Economically, the United States comes out of World War One looking great economically. The values of the 19th century middle class, particularly the Protestant work ethic, self-denial, and frugality, gave way to a fascination with consumption, leisure, and self-realization. Some of the essential features of modern life: the business government partnership fostered by World War One expanded throughout the 1920s, and the business owner now had a more positive image. The Progressive Era had come to an end until FDR becomes president in the 1930s. So it is a decade of the first decade of American history where Americans really became obsessed with celebrities. Celebrities such as sports athletes like Babe Ruth and boxer Jack Dempsey, guys like Charles Lindbergh, who flew first person to fly solo across the Atlantic. You also have obsession with actors and actresses because of Hollywood producing silent films early part in the decade, and then by 1927, the first movie with sound, The Jazz Singer, in 1927. Also, jazz musicians were celebrities and so forth. Also, sex became a topic more discussed in public than had been in the Victorian era of the late 1800s and even the first couple decades of the 1900s, where it was a topic you just did not talk about in public. And it was even mentioned in movies and so forth. It's a period of kind of, as as my students used to say years ago, YOLO, you only live once. Yeah, not everybody in the population is doing that, certainly, but you have an increasing number than had been in the Victorian era. It is a return to normalcy in the sense that going back to the days of the Gilded Age where the government is going to be more hands-off and try to help economic growth. The U.S. also turned inward with its foreign policy instead of being more involved in foreign affairs like it had been in 1917, 1918, World War One. Now it's going to go back to isolation. Also, the 1920s, which I'll cover in a later part of the recorded lecture on the 1920s, talk about the importance of jazz. And it is the first modern era of the United States in terms of what we see as a modern American culture emerging. So the 20s is kind of the last decade of the second phase industrial revolution. You have Americans owning more cars than any other country in the world. Electricity had completely replaced steam power by the 1920s. Henry Ford created the first moving assembly line. Okay, that's what I mean by modern. There have been assembly lines in the past, but where this was like actually moving down a conveyor belt, that's what we mean by modern assembly line. And I'll cover Henry Ford a little bit later. Also, the rise of the airline industry, thanks to men such as Glenn Curtiss. and of course the Wright brothers who invented the first airplane, but also modern appliances. And really, life became a little more convenient for Americans. That was very popular. Let's get to the election of 1920. James M. Cox of Ohio and ran as president for the Democratic Party, while the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's cousin, ran as a VP candidate. But for the Republicans, it was Warren G. Harding, governor of Ohio, and then Calvin Coolidge, who had been governor of Massachusetts and so forth. I'm sorry, he was actually governor of Vermont. I knew it was a New England state. Harding promised a return to normalcy, ending the progressive era and going back to more laissez-faire. On election day, Harding won a landslide, even though there was a lower voter turnout. And Republicans are going to dominate politics in the 1920s until FDR and Democrats come sweeping into Congress in 1932. Now, what's interesting, Harding is ranked as actually one of the worst presidents in American history. He admitted in private that he was not qualified to be president. That's not the kind of guy you want to be president of the United States. He is going to have some corruption under his cabinet, and he's also going to die in office. Now, Calvin Coolidge, as vice president, is also going to replace him as president and then get elected in 1924. Nothing corrupt about Coolidge, and just quietly, unassuming, kind of does a good job in his time in office. So one of the things is that Harding did appoint a number of Ohio individuals. Coolidge was not one of them. He's from Vermont, but that he called the Ohio Gang because they were mostly from his home state of Ohio. Charles Evans Hughes, the former Reform governor of New York, Supreme Court Justice and presidential candidate, took firm control as Secretary of State. Secretary of Agriculture Henry C. Wallace created new links with farm organizations like Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone, a future Chief Justice, and he cleaned up the mess at the Department of Justice left by the Palmer raids. Financier Andrew W. Mellon, he was not corrupt, ran the Treasury Department, quickly reduced the high wartime tax rates, freeing up money for private investment. Stone was only appointed Attorney General after Harry M. Daugherty was sentenced to prison as Attorney General under Harding. Attorney General Daugherty was investigated by the U.S. Senate for the legal sale of pardons and liquor permits. Now, what was interesting is that the 19th Amendment outlawed the production of alcohol, but the Attorney General could issue individual liquor permits, which sounds like a double standard, just because it was, and you could bribe him to give him one. He was forced to resign, but was not sent to prison because two different juries could not agree. So here's James M. Cox of Ohio and FDR. So you had two guys from Ohio running opposed to each other. And so you can see Harding does well. They were fed up with some of the policies of Wilson because of the Treaty of Versailles flop. And you can see Eugene Debs gets almost a million votes from prison. Here is some of his Ohio gang members. Not everybody's from Ohio, but many were. Also, Herbert Hoover is in this cabinet, and he's going to become a future president. All right. So Herbert Hoover was the Commerce Secretary and did quite well. He was not corrupt. In fact, I always kind of feel bad for Hoover. He kind of came in at the wrong time in American history. The Commerce Department fostered the creation of the 2,000 trade associations representing companies in almost every major industry. Government officials worked closely with the associations, providing them with statistical research, assisting them to devise industry-wide standards, and urging them to stabilize prices and wages. Here's what you can remember about the economy of the 1920s until the stock market crash. Booming, booming, and booming. The problem is people had an unrealistic expectation of that booming staying long term. Okay. Hoover hoped to achieve voluntary cooperation instead of government regulation. Most complied, but not all. The Federal Trade Commission ignored antitrust laws that forbade restraints on trade, so Teddy Roosevelt would have been unhappy, such as collusion among companies on prices. William Howard Taft also served as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this time and really loved his role there. So you have a former president becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, only American president to have done that. And despite some good appointments, Harding did appoint a corrupt Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall. And let me kind of explain what Albert B. Fall did. This guy on the bottom left, he looks a little bit corrupt in that picture. It's because he was. It's called the Teapot Dome scandal. All right, so way back in the early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt had set aside some land that oil men knew had petroleum on it. One of them was in Teapot Dome, Wyoming. The other one was in Elk Hills, California. And the purpose of this land was to be preserved as oil reserves for future generations. So if we got into a bind and we needed oil, like say World War II, you could drill there and get petroleum there quickly. So what had happened was the Secretary of Interior, Albert B. Falls, secretly accepted a bribe from an oil man by the name of Henry F. Sinclair and also Edward L. Donahue for about $100,000. And what they bribed him was to allow their companies to secretly drill on the naval oil reserves of Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California. It's called the Teapot Dome scandal, and this is supposed to be a teapot about to crush some people in its wake, this political cartoon, which is kind of funny. And what ends up happening is Fall was found guilty, but Sinclair and Donahue were acquitted, which is kind of bogus. They clearly offered him a bribe. And what ends up happening is this comes out right about the time Harding died of a heart attack while he was in San Francisco in August of 1923. So Harding actually didn't have to deal with the backlash. Coolidge became president. Coolidge had nothing to do with it, so he was okay. Also, the head of the Veterans Bureau, which was established for World War I veterans, Charles R. Forbes, who actually was a deserter of the military, ironically, was convicted of looting $200 million from the government. So basically, Charles R. Forbes, this scumbag, not only did he desert the United States military, he also looted $200 million from the Veterans Bureau. What the heck? Okay? What a bum. And so Harding dies, and I always found this political cartoon almost always used to be on the AP exam for U.S. history. It's great. One of the funnier ones. Just crushed one guy's hat and hand are sticking out. And here is Silent Cal. They called him Silent Cal because he's a very quiet man, which is kind of interesting. He got into politics. Probably would not have been president had he not been VP, and then Harding died. But because the economy was good, he gets reelected in 1924. But here's one of my favorite stories about Coolidge. Because he hardly said anything, there were some men who had a bet that they couldn't get him to say 3 words at a dinner. And so the guy who bet that he said he could, Coolidge had heard about it, and he walked up to him and he said, "You lose." So he only said 2 words, and so the guy lost the bet. All right, so the tariffs are raised to protect American industry. Corporate and income taxes are cut. Now, the income taxes were really high during World War I. In fact, on the highest income earners, they were over 70%. So it was nuts. The income tax needed to come down somewhat. And so low taxes, high tariffs, and then low spending. And that was a 3-prong attack to have a good economy in the 1920s. So the government had a big business cooperation. And they used to say under Coolidge, the business of government is business. But foreign policy, the United States is not going to be involved. Now, election of 1924, John W. Davis of West Virginia runs as a Democrat. Robert La Follette, the famous reform progressive governor of Wisconsin, ran as a Progressive Party, hoping to revitalize that Bull Moose Party of Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. It fails. And so you can see, La Follette didn't do bad. He got 4.8 million votes, but only 13 electoral votes. So not going to get you the OW. Even if you combine Davis and La Follette, Coolidge still would have won because people were happy with a good economy. All right, so let's talk about women in politics. After achieving the suffrage in 1920, women expanded their political activism. Women were only granted token positions, and African-American women had greater difficulty as they struggled for voting rights in the South, as well as they pushed for a federal anti-lynching law. The lynching period of American history where lynching was illegal, but they were getting away with it in various states across the country. Particularly the worst were in the Deep South. In fact, they've got a museum now in Montgomery about kind of forgotten part of American history about lynching. It's horrific period of American history, but they're not able to get a federal anti-lynching law. The Women's Joint Congressional Committee joined with other women's organizations to get the Shepard-Towner Federal Maternity and Infancy Act passed in 1921, and it is the first federally funded healthcare legislation. So what in the world was it? Okay. It is designed to give federal funds to help establish medical clinics, prenatal educational programs, and visiting nurse projects in hopes of lowering the death rates among infants, which it really was effective. Critics claim that it was a communist plot to socialize American medicine, which it wasn't. By the end of the decade, congressmen cut off funding to it. And so basically, today we have federal funding for similar programs, and it's not controversial, but back then it was. Let's look at corporate capitalism. So let's look at this three-pronged attack by to raise the economy: lower taxes, lower federal spending, higher tariffs equals strong national economy. It worked in the 1920s. Okay. Now, the Fordham-McCumber tariff was a little more reasonable tariff, but then when the Great Depression hits with the stock market crash in 1929, the federal government foolishly decided to pass the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which is one of the dumbest economic decisions in American history, and it raised the tariff to an unbelievable 60%. You cannot have international trade when your tax rate's at 60% on imports. So all the other countries put 6% tax rate on ours, and nobody's trading. Okay. So one of the things that began happening at this time is that businesses began consolidating to form large corporations. And today we see tons of large corporations in American society and the American economy. So during the 1920s, businesses combined at a rapid rate, with the largest number of mergers occurring in rapidly growing industries such as chemicals like DuPont, electrical appliances and machinery like Westinghouse and General Electric, and automobiles with General Motors. Rarely did any single corporation monopolize an entire industry. Rather, an oligarchy, a few major producers dominated the market and controlled prices, similar to what you see today with Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, and T-Mobile. The nation's financial institutions expanded and consolidated along with its corporations. Total banking assets rose from $48 billion in 1919 to a whopping $72 billion in 1929 before the stock market crash. And in 1929, almost half of the nation's banking resources were controlled by 1% of Americans' banks, a mere 250 depositories. So the nation's top 250 banks were controlling like 99% of, or certainly over half of the nation's banking resources. Pretty crazy. So it is one of the causes of the stock market crash, and we'll get to that when we get to the Great Depression. There's several causes. There's more than one. So let's look at the economy in the 1920s. Great, great, and great. So after massive inflation right after the war, we see massive inflation right after World War II as well, so that's a commonality. The economy steadied in 1922 and began to grow smoothly and almost continuously. Between 1922 and 1929, the gross domestic product grew from $74.1 billion to a whopping $103.1 billion. That is nuts. Approximately 40%, and per capita income rose impressively from $641 a year to $847. Now, that would be, you think $641 a year for a family, that's not very much. But if you think about it, jumping up from $641 to $847, you put that in today's economic terms, that's a huge, huge increase in your standard of living. An abundance of new consumer products, particularly the automobile, sparked economic growth during the 1920s. A lot of jobs were found in the automobile manufacturing industry, and you can make good wages in those factories too. Manufacturing output expanded 64% during the decade as factories churned out millions of cars, refrigerators, stoves, and radios. To produce these goods, basic industries supplied huge quantities of raw materials: steel, copper, chemicals, natural gas, electrical power, oil, and gasoline. And because the United States is resource rich, we can provide it. Okay. Now, one group that does not struggle at that does struggle at this time is the farmers, and so they're going to struggle, and then the Great Depression is going to get worse. The government did try to help some, but Coolidge vetoed both bills as special interest legislation. And between 1919 and 1929, the farmers' share of the national income plummeted from 16% to 8.8%. Coal and textiles suffered like the farmers during the 1920s as well. So farming, coal, and textiles did not do as well, but the other industries did great. The 1920s was a heyday of welfare capitalism, a system of labor relations that stressed management's responsibility for employees' well-beings. So this is where you start seeing for the first time companies offering health insurance. Okay, now today it's a big topic of debate with the federal health insurance. It's almost viewed that health insurance is a right as U.S. citizen. Back then, health insurance didn't exist until the first some of these major corporations started offering to attract and recruit and retain really talented, high quality business employees. General Electric, U.S. Steel, and other large corporations offered health insurance. On top of that, they offered old age pensions. Okay, my parents are retired, and their retirement's through the state of Arkansas state employee pension. The opportunity to buy stock in the company at below market prices. We still see shares of stocks given as benefits for employees today by companies. Other firms subsidize mortgages or contributed to employee savings plans, which I know of a guy who the company he works for, I forgot how much contributes to his savings account. Their goal was to create a loyal and long-serving workforce. And at this time it worked. You'd have people that work 30, 40 years for the same company and then they retire. And so particularly among salaried employees, mostly managers and office workers and important wage workers, such as shop foremen. Another reason this was to dissuade workers from joining unions. Decisions by the conservative-minded Supreme Court undercut union activism and government regulation of the labor market. In Colorado Coal Company versus United Mine Workers, the court ruled that a striking union could be penalized for legal restraint of trade. The court also struck down federal legislation regulating child labor in Atkins versus Children's Hospital, and it voided a minimum wage for women workers in the District of Columbia. Union membership during this decade fell from 5.1 million in 1920 to 3.6 million in 1929. So World War I was probably the height of union membership up to this point. It's going to increase during World War II and then steadily decline all the way to present day. Now let's look at economic policies abroad. American manufacturers actively promoted foreign sales of consumer products such as radios, telephones, automobiles, and sewing machines. To supply these markets, firms built factories in foreign countries and bought up existing businesses. General Electric set up production facilities in Latin America, China, Japan, and Australia, for instance. Attracted by lower livestock prices, three major American meat packers, Gustavus Swift, Armour, and Wilson, built plants in Argentina. Standard Oil acquired oil reserves in Mexico and Venezuela. And during the 1920s, foreign investments by U.S. corporations more than doubled to a total of $15.2 billion. American banks also emerged as key players in the post-war debt system. The banks lent money to Germany. And what's going to happen is, as banks lend money to Germany, Germany is going to use that money to pay back the reparation payments for Britain and France. And then Britain and France would take the money and pay back the U.S. Financiers who they took loans from, such as J.P. Morgan during World War I. What's happening is nobody really is getting fully paid off. Okay. One of the things is that tariffs are going to make it difficult for European countries to pay back their debts because they need Americans to buy their goods. There was also a Dawes plan that helped reduce reparations that Germany owed so they could pay it out over a longer period of time and make it a more manageable monthly amount that they could actually pay. All this depended on a steady flow, though, of cash from the U.S. and from Europe back to the U.S. This fragile and unstable system of international finance collapsed in the wake of the American stock market crash in October of 1929. We'll cover that a little bit more when we get to the Great Depression. All right, let's look at the foreign policies. Last topic for this part, and then we'll get to part two in a little bit. So basically, the foreign policy of the United States in the 1920s is isolation. We are going to open up new trade markets, but in terms of interfering with other countries, we're not going to be doing that. We're not going to join the League of Nations because they got voted down with the Treaty of Versailles not getting ratified. Officials in the Department of State and the Department of Commerce work constantly to open up new foreign markets for manufacturers and bankers and to protect existing American interests in other countries. But other than that, not so much. Now, one thing the United States does continue is its military intervention in Latin America in the 1920s. At one point, the United States sent troops to the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 1924. American military forces likewise remained in Nicaragua almost continuously from 1912 to 1933 because of political turmoil and economic turmoil. Also, the United States had troops in occupied Haiti from 1950 to 1934. They were small forces, but designed to provide stability. Also, Mexico tried to nationalize its oil. Tensions continue to remain tense. What they mean by nationalize is Standard Oil had built a bunch of oil drilling facilities and refining facilities Mexico's government just seized it and kicked Standard Oil out, which is a violation of private property. But what's crazy is Mexico is still using some of the same technology that Standard Oil had used in the 1920s. Let's talk about the Washington Conference and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Basically, several countries met in Washington, D.C. in 1921, and basically these countries agreed to reduce some naval armaments. So the Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, was able to get the major powers to get rid of some of their battleships and halt the construction of large battleships for 10 years because they're hoping to not have another World War I failure at that. They were also supposed to maintain the tonnage of naval vessels among Britain, the US, Japan, France, and Italy at a fixed ratio. So you can see right here, this is where Japan really feels like they get screwed. For every 5 US battleships, Britain can have 5, Japan can have 3, France can have 1.67, Italy can have 1.67. Okay. Also, this five-power naval treaty of 1922 had the U.S. and Britain agree to refrain from fortifying their far eastern possessions. Japan did not have to abide by that, though. No restrictions have been placed on small warships, and so forth. Japan really feels like they get screwed, and they're going to be bitter about this. Okay. Also, there was a nine-power treaty. It's open door policy in China continuing. Now, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, this one I think is almost laughable because it looks good on paper and is completely and utterly worthless. Okay, so American Secretary of State, by this point, Frank Kellogg, persuaded French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand, so it's called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, to support a broader pact of condemning militarism. 15 nations signed the pact in Paris in 1928, and 48 more approved it later. These signatories agreed to condemn the recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and renounce it as an instrument of national policy. So the problem is that they're agreeing to outlaw war as a form of foreign policy. Well, how are you going to stop a country that goes to war? Oh, by declaring war. It's one of those things, it makes you feel good on paper. It didn't do diddly squat. It's not really doing anything. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact sounds good, worthless. No enforcement, and so forth. All right, we will come to the new national court culture and part 2.